Let's get started. Welcome to the Institute of International Studies at UC Berkeley series on Asian security challenges for the 2013-2014 academic year. My name is Neil Jog. I'm the genial host of this series and visiting scholar here at the Institute. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome our guest today, Cui Liru, who is the former president of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations in China. He is a scholar in his own right, having completed his scholarly work at Fudan University in China, and then having begun work as a specialist on U.S. foreign policy at the Institute in Beijing. He also had a stint as the Chinese representative and counselor to their permanent mission at the United Nations. In 1994, he then moved up within the CICIR, called CICIR ranks, to be the North American Studies Division Director. He had a stint after that in 1996 for a little under a decade at the Institute of World Information in Beijing, and then in 2005 returned to his origins at CICIR as the president from 2005 for 8 years until 2013. He now serves as a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and also serves as a member of the Foreign Policy Consulting Committee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's a pleasure to welcome him here. Cui and I knew each other when I was teaching in China some 30 years ago, and old ties don't do last, and it's a pleasure to be able to host him. I gave a series of lectures when I was in China at the time, and now it's a great pleasure to be able to return the compliment and invite him here to give us just a single lecture at UC Berkeley. It's his first visit here in any substantial way, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce him and now turn the mic over to him. Thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Neil. Very delighted to be here, and also it's a great honor to be here. And UC Berkeley is a very famous university in China. And when I walk around the campus here, I see many Asian faces here. So I just feel kind of a natural connection across the Pacific. And my topic today is the current challenges of U.S. China relations. I will spend about 30 to 40 minutes to give my presentations, then I will take your questions. And on the whole, I think the current China-U.S. relations is facing the challenges from two aspects. And one is because of the rise in China, the U.S.-China relations has come into a new period, a new stage. The competition aspect of this relationship has been rising. We see more tensions and more frictions, or maybe some conflicts. And how to handle this kind of competition? I think that this is important challenges for us, for both China and the United States, for the government and for the public, for the elites. And the second challenge is a global challenge, a common challenge. I think we all know and we all live in the process of globalization. And we become very much closer than before. And at the same time, we are confronted with more and more prominent global challenges, which require we work together. And China and the United States should and will play major roles to address these challenges. But how to do that? I think it depends in some way or in some extent on how do we recognize, comprehend the first challenges and how to handle that, which have a great impact on how do we work together to address the second aspect of our challenges. So the competition between China and the United States is something new, I think. It is there will always be competitions and between the nations, but the relations between China and the United States, as I see it, is kind of something different than some other relations. I would call the Sino-U.S. relations is a kind of relationship of a peculiar balance between the two large countries of great asymmetry. China and the United States are very much different countries. And these differences, good things, but sometimes bad things for us, especially could be the obstacles, barriers for us to communicate, to understand each other. So I think especially here in Berkeley here, most people know China quite well. And after more than 30 or 40 years, normalization of our relations, and we have much better understanding with each other. And we understand better this is two different countries. We have very different history, very different culture. In some way, China represents some kind of Oriental culture. And the United States, of course, is kind of representative of the Western culture, original from the Europe. When I use the term as the asymmetric, that means we could be the counterpart of the other side when we talk about bilateral relations. But if we compare our cultures, our political systems, our histories, even our geographical phenomena, natural conditions, which are so different. And in economic terms, we are in a very different developing stage. China is still a developing country, but the United States is developed, is a very much a modern country. When we say United States is a superpower, it's not merely mean United States is a military powerful country, economically powerful country. It also means to China, it's an advanced country, it's a modern country. And China and the United States is different. It's this kind of asymmetry in some time could be complementary. Economically speaking, we are complementary for many years. But now, this kind of complementariness has become kind of much smaller. We have become more competitive with each other. So the competition become a new prominent phenomenon between our two countries. Because these are two large countries, the competition will not develop or happen only between our two nations. It could also have repercussions in our neighbors, in our Asian Pacific areas, even in some other areas in the world. We haven't been experiencing the level of competition we are now experiencing, because for many years China is less developed, China is much weaker. And if we look back the history of Sino-U.S. relations, when the United States joined the Western powers to be engaged with China, at that time, just to try to find some more new interests in China in commercial terms and also in some other terms. And China was weaker. United States had kind of psychology to, in some way, to stand by the underdog side. So China has been the underdog for many years. When China was aggressed by the Japan, when China was even earlier invaded by the Western powers in the Opium War. But at the same time, the United States carried very realistic policies, pragmatic policies, even though they principally criticized, condemned the gunboat policies of the other powers. But they would also like to have their interests, the privileges, obtained by the other powers. So that is kind of a due policy of the United States towards China. We also remember in the Second World War, at that time, China and United States are alliance, fighting against Japanese invaders. And after the World War II, United States and the Soviet Union and Great Britain, the mainly three major powers, just sit together and discuss about the post-war world order. At the time, China was one of the important members in some occasions, but generally speaking, was not in the core of the discussions teams. So the post-war arrangement, including some important core interest of China, has been decided by the other major powers. At the time, the United States play the main role there. So this is the background of our relations. Now the difference is that after the normalization of our relations in late 1970s, and China started its process under the policy of reform and open up to the world. It's a national normalization, national modernization process. And in my view, aftermath, the U.S. China relations in many ways are in a process of consequential of the modernization of China. And we have become more and more engaged and more dependent with each other when China has been engaged with this world more and more. I just put it simply of China's reform and the open door policy. What is reform? Reform is to build a market economy from a planned economy for about 20 years. Opening up simply is to be engaged with the world. Now China has been deeply engaged with this world. And the United States welcome China start this process. The process of being engaged with the world, the process at the same time of the modernize this very ancient country. This modernization process, when it goes on, it gives China more and more the characteristic of a modern country. In some way, this will make China have more similarities with other countries, because as a follower of the modernization process, we have learned a lot from the Western countries, from the Europe countries, from the United States, and from Japan. So this is a learning process. That's also true for China. And also, if we compare the capabilities and the strength and the power between China and the United States, this is a huge asymmetry. So for quite a long time, the United States was not worried about China, only welcomed a China which is carrying a policy of reform and the open door policy. But now the thing's different. China is rising up, especially after the financial and economic crisis. And this put China into a much higher place, in center place in the stage of the world arena, which China is not fully prepared for. At the same time, I think China is in a relatively better shape than the United States and other Western powers. And just in a few years, or 2 or 3 years, China from, in terms of GDP, a number 6 or 5, then to the number 2 positions. And the United States suddenly found China has become a runner-up as a world power. So this has changed in some way the balance of U.S. China relations. Still, this relation is asymmetric, but which is sort of different from the relationship before. That means more competitions. We have become with each other the competitor or contenders. Of course, not really adversaries. But some people are worried about we could possibly become adversaries. So this is something discussed heatedly in the two nations, in the government, in the elite circles, even in the public. This is the second thing I think we should recognize. Then the third point I want to make here is now we are in a very much critical transitional period. Both United States and China, especially China. China has been, in long time, has been focused in its central task, that is to develop its economies, and which is still true in the next 10 or 20 years. China's foreign policy, in many ways, as I observed, is the extension of its internal affairs. China's foreign policy's main task is to create a favorable international environment for its economic development. So it's characterized by these kind of features, that is to be low profile, to be reactive, in some way, yes, defensive, and passive. So when China was weaker, and with this kind of diplomacy, and China and the United States is not, or was not, a pair of competitors. But after it has become more prominent or noticeable that China is a rising power, the picture has been changed somewhat. And the United States discussed about a rising China. Rising China means the future, more possibilities of a new challenge to the United States, especially when China became the number 2 in its GDP, or also in many ways regarded as in comprehensive terms. And how to handle this kind of rising power of a new China. This is a big challenge to the United States foreign policy and a challenge to the Sino-U.S. relations. And for China, this is also a challenge. And China have become more and more aware and about the new situation in the international arena, especially the new situation in our neighboring areas. Because China has become a rising power, we're experiencing more tensions. Our neighboring countries are becoming more concerned about China, which is very much different when they have benefited a lot from China's process of developing its economic development. Especially those nations, they have some disputes with China, especially in terms of sovereignty and the territory issues. They are concerned about a stronger China can play hegemony in this area. And they believe in the future, and China could be stronger, and they could in a more unfavorable position. So they would like to bring some other powers, the outside powers. The United States is the major one. And for them to have a balancer against the rising power. And the United States would like to have this kind of situation because the United States is also worried about the uncertainties in the future and what kind of role China is going to play. And we see the balance of the regional situation, the balance of the global order, and the balance of the bilateral relations are in the process of changing, and especially from the last several years, maybe in the 2010 to next 5 to 10 years. This is the critical period of transition. We will see the redistribution of powers in some way. And the people talked about whether the United States is in the process of decline. Or people also talk about if China can sustain its growing of its economy and the development of its power, or China could collapse in some way because it faced a very serious domestic challenge and external challenge too. So I think in this period, we have more risks. The risks is not because of this kind of competition. China and the United States will become adversaries or will go to confrontational situation in some way. But more likely, we can have some misjudgment or based on some misperception with each other. And the antagonism will come to dominate our relations. And something unexpected events or things happened and the misjudgment could lead us to some kind of situation that we go to confrontation. It is not impossible. So then the major task, I think, in this period is how to manage this kind of more risk relations. This has been discussed in Washington and also in Beijing. So the management has become the key word of our relationship in this period. But I would also say this is only one part of our relationship. The other part of our relationship is much more positive. Although we have come to a more risk period, but still we can enjoy what I would call the strategic stability of these two big countries. In the last 40 years, China and the United States have developed and established some kind of comprehensive mechanisms of communication, of dialogue, of tackle the difficult situations or incidents. And all these mechanisms are still working between us, which provided a very important framework for both sides to handle our relations. Important characteristics of this relationship is that it is mainly dominated by the leadership role. We all know in the early period, and Deng Xiaoping played a key role and a dominant role in China's policies. In the later period in China, we come to a kind of collective leadership, which is different from Deng Xiaoping and the Mao Zedong era. But still, the leaders established a kind of positive and constructive relationships. And nowadays, there is a new leadership in China. So the first task for the new leader, President Xi Jinping, is to have a very constructive and a deep dialogue with President Obama in Sunnyland, California, to discuss very fundamental things between us. And after that, we continued our strategic and economic dialogue, which was the major platform for both sides to discuss most important issues in various kind of areas. And we see the very fruitful result of this year's strategic and economic dialogue. So I think these two dialogues have set a very positive tone of our future relationship. And one of the terminology to reflect this kind of positive tone is to build a new type or new model of relations between our two countries. This is a kind of terminology proposed by China and later embraced by the United States. Although both sides have some differences when they use these terms, or even sometimes they use different terms. In the official statement, United States government used the term of new model of cooperation. That is the more official terminology. But in some other occasions, also use the new model or new type of relationships. I think we can understand this kind of terminology, its implications in two aspects. The first, that means we should avoid the worst thing in the future between us. And because we become more competitive with each other, the first thing is to avoid the competition could develop into a kind of confrontation. Both sides realized that will be very bad, will be disastrous for us. And if confrontation occurred, probably there will be no winners. And both of us will be losers. But we can have more constructive implications for this new type of relationship between us. But that is in the longer term. That is to develop a more constructive partnership relationship between us. It is required. It is also possible if we both serious and take a positive attitude and make concrete steps in the patient, in long-term view, step by step towards that kind of goal. The reason is now we have in a very much new era, the era of globalization, and the world has become more and more multipolar. And the multipolar is a kind of thing debated in both China and the United States. And some people argue that multipolar is not a kind of structure and stable as the bipolar or even unipolar. But I would argue that multipolar probably is more stable because it means we're turning to a more normal situation among the states. Multipolar means those major countries will come to its normal situation. China is one of them. I think United States is a great country. It's a very powerful and a superpower for many years. Of course, for United States, we would like to be the superpower for much longer or even forever. But I don't think this is a normal situation. If Chinese people work hard, if Chinese government capable enough, and China should not be always have such a huge gap from the United States. In the last 30 or 40 years development proved China can be much better. The same is true for a number of other major countries. So if they all become normal, so this world has to be multipolarized. That means the multipolarized world should have a kind of different order from the order we have now. This is a heritage from the order of after World War II, then the collapse of Soviet Union, when the United States was the only superpower and played a dominant role. And the United States even realized and as the superpower is a good thing, but also a huge burden. Now its foreign policy is trying to withdraw from some commitment, from some obligations, because it's very costly. And it would like to have some other countries to share the burdens. If other countries could share the burdens, they must be capable. That means they must grow up, they must be stronger. So the world in the future means, and not only the United States, but a number of other countries should work together. We may not have only one power centers. We may have several, numerous power centers. But at the same time, we are interdependent. And we have to work together to address the global challenges we all confronted with. So this is a kind of conceptual things, but it is based on the changing realities which is occurring nowadays now. I think I just stopped my presentation here, and I will be delighted to take your questions. Thank you.
thank you very much, Dr. Cui, for your comments. And let me now turn to the audience. I made my own list of concerns that I wanted to raise, but I want to defer to our audience first. So, yes, right in the front row, please.
Hi. One of the areas of tension, I gather, between the United States and China has been, well, in broadest terms, the relationships with the Islamic world. It's focusing now a lot on Iran and possible worries about nuclear ambitions there. But also, I mean, there's a lot of, if China looks out into South Asia or West Asia, they'll see a lot of violence and chaos. Some of it we started in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of it we didn't start in Chechnya or Syria, maybe. I wonder, how does China? We seem to be at odds over what to do about the Middle East. What is China's view on how to fix that, or how do we deal with the Middle East, or do we even bother?
I apologize, a little late. Could you identify yourself? Just let us know who you are when you.
Oh, sorry. I'm Steve Harris. I work at Lawrence Berkeley Lab.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. Actually, this is a new challenge for China foreign policy. My observation is that China is now facing the challenge that is to launch another process other than its domestic development. That is a new policy process. That means from how to play a role in the global arena. China has been playing some roles in the global arena, but not as a comprehensive strategic thinking. In many ways, it's kind of a passive reactions to what happened to her. In the Middle East affairs, I think China has been developed its more interest in these areas. For instance, China has depended much more on the Middle East oil nowadays. I think we import about 50% of the oil we need from other parts of the world. And I think among these 50%, I think maybe more than 50 is from Middle East. So we will depend more on the Middle East oil than the United States in the future, and maybe already now. So China is much more concerned with the situation in the Middle East, which is very much different from before. And maybe 10 years ago, we see Middle East are very far areas. We do not care much. And of course, we're concerned in things there, but it's not directly involved in the Middle East. But at the same time, I think there is a serious debate in China about what kind of role China can play. For the government policy, first, our leadership realized China should play a more important or positive role there. So then we see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs send some envoys in the Middle East when some situation required China's roles there, which is different from before. Then these situations sometimes require the Security Council of UN to discuss about, and China play a role in the Security Council as a permanent member. And but a difficult question for China is how to handle the situation like Syria. One of the important principles is to not interfere of internal affairs of China's foreign policy. But nowadays we see this kind of situation is complicated, especially when the humanitarian things happened. What attitude China should take? And my observation is that basically China would agree that some outside interference in some special situations. But the precondition is we should have the UN authority of the Security Council. And another condition is that if the majority of the neighboring countries concerned, nations around, such as Arab League, they would have consensus or resolution to require the outside involvement, China would possibly take a positive attitude. The case is in the Libya. And also the Libya case have some negative impact of the China policy in the Syria. Because Libya's situation at the time, we agree with the UN resolution. But later on, the no-flying zone resolution has become a kind of approval for the Western powers to directly interfere and to stand on the part of opposition forces to overthrow the Libyan government, although we do not also like Gaddafi very much. But this is a kind of abuse of the authority of the resolution. So the policy has been seriously criticized domestically. I think this had an important impact of China's attitude in the Syria problem. What I'm talking about is this difficult situation for China. We have not thought it through about what kind of role we can play. And another condition is China will play according its capacities and capabilities. Most people believe China is still lack that kind of capacity of the United States to play a more active role in that kind of area. So far, you see, China is in some way is still in the outskirts of the activity things. And so another thing is, in some way, China and the Russians have a kind of coordinated relationships in these kind of situations. And this is one of the factors we have to consider.
If I could just supplement the question briefly before taking another question from the floor. You made a comment in your talk that to some extent China's foreign policy is an extension of its internal concerns, focused on the economic side. Is there any connection between China's increasing concern with events in the Middle East that you described over the past decade, as in contrast to before? Is there any connection between that increased interest and rising concerns with the Muslim population and the challenge to central authority in Pakistan, within China?
In the Middle East, I don't think that is direct important factors there, and. But indirectly, I think in some way, but it's not that kind of substantial factors.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, please, right in the middle. And again, if you wouldn't mind telling us who you are as you ask your question.
I'm Henry. I'm a junior. My basic question is, you mentioned that the Chinese economic policy is tied to its foreign policy and that you foresee economic policy being entwined with U.S. economic policy in the future. But how does the U.S. differences in foreign and domestic policy with China's foreign and domestic policy, for instance, in Taiwan or even in the form of government, going to play, in fact, with the foreseeable economic concerns?
I didn't quite get your questions.
Essentially what I'm asking is, you want further economic cooperation, but there's significant domestic and foreign tension. And I was wondering if you thought that that was going to resolve itself through economic processes, or if it was going to be a natural part of the economic growth, or whether it would have to be resolved in other arenas.
You mean the Taiwan issue?
It was just an example.
I think the central task of the Chinese government is still economic development. I think that is also true for the United States. So for that reasons, and we have more to cooperate than we have contradictions. And for China, I think China's foreign policy and what role China is going to play in a larger part to be determined by the things going on at home. If we can sustain our economic development, we can improve our domestic situations, and China's government can be in a much better positions to play a more constructive and positive role in its external activities. So this can be true for the most cases of our foreign policies. But at the same time, we realize that China's domestic economic development has been very much closely related with what's going on in the other parts of the world, because China's economic interest has already spreading into all parts of the world. So now the process of new foreign policy is important for China to combine this domestic requirement, domestic development, with our kind of changing role in the world of our diplomacy. And I think we are just in this kind of stage, and the discussions is going on underway in China about this kind of new roles. But to be frank with you, in China, and very different opinions on that. And in some ways, China has become more and more alike in some way to the Western countries. At least I can say in one aspect, that is, we become more familiar with the international theory and the policies of the Western countries, the United States, the realism theories there. So these dominant thinkings in some ways also have greater influence of China's foreign policy. I don't know it's good or bad, but if we think our roles and international politics all based on the realism, there could be more chance to become adversaries. So, but another school of thinking is about the constructionism, and that is also seriously discussed about. And someone would relate that constructivism with the China's traditional culture. We are in the process of that. I think the interplay between China and other countries, especially the interplay between China and the United States, is important. If this interplay is constructive, and China will develop in a more positive direction, which could contribute in a more constructive way. If this interplay turn out to be kind of more negative and passive, and it could also affect China's role in the future.
Yes, please, in the third row here, and then we'll go into the back. Thank you very much.
My name is Miranda Ewell. I'm a Berkeley resident. It's interesting to hear in your discussion, in your lecture, the concepts at a very, I want to say, macro level, sort of the government thinking. You were saying the discussions among the elite and discussions in Beijing and discussions in Washington. But I wonder what you think, or what the thinking is in Beijing about in the future, the other aspect of relations between the two countries on a people-to-people level, because of the technology that is just changing tremendously. It seems almost day to day. Young people in the United States and young people in China watch the same videos on YouTube, Gangnam Style. Everybody's crazy about that. There's a kind. I mean, you could talk about the differences in culture, but there's also a lot of sharedness in the world now because of the technology. And you talk about China's openness, opening its doors and openness to the world. Some people would say it's not open enough yet. And that there needs to be more. I'm just curious about what you think about of the relations between the countries on that level, on the people-to-people level.
And thank you very much for your comments. I think it's true, and I agree with what you have said. And this is a very important part of our relationship, and the people-to-people's contact. In the process of modernization, as a society, I think China would become more alike of other countries, especially the younger generation. I think the science and technology has brought many things in the same way to different countries. And the younger generations in China, I think they live with the internet, this kind of information society. And their thinkings, the way of thinking or mindset, in some way very much similar to the kids, to the young people here. So I think the new technology even changed the cultures of the nations. And China cannot be excluded. I think this is something become more important in the future of our relationships. I agree with you. I think the interesting thing is we have the young new leaders. You have the new leaders, but the second term of President Obama. And Xi Jinping is a kind of new generation from the previous leaders. I think he has more understandings about this kind of modern society things. And this is something good for us to understand each other better.
I'm going to put our guest on the spot a little bit because part of the program today was to ask the Chinese Students Association on campus if they'd like to have a small number of their membership meet with him. So they had a chance to speak for about an hour. And so what we had was half a dozen UC Berkeley undergrads, all of them of Chinese parentage, but all of them born in the United States, and talking to you about your views on the U.S., their views on China, and so on. In the vein of what you were just saying, this is sort of even a next generation beyond President Obama and Premier Xi. What was your impression of that exchange, and did it leave you with new ideas about how people-to-people relations might develop?
I think in China, and the election of President Obama is something very much important and very much noticed development in the United States political arenas. And most people, including people in the elite circles or the specialists, scholars, would give a very positive comments of Obama's thinkings about the U.S. foreign policies. But in the United States, it is kind of criticized of his policies to be kind of naive. I think, of course, President Obama does not have enough practical experience as the president. But generally speaking, his thinking is based on the kind of multilateralism. I think this is kind of things. I just listened to his speech in the UN yesterday, and we can realize that he's trying to strike a balance in the different factors and the forces, and trying to be more reasonable and at the same time realistic. But in its practical process, it could be very much difficult to achieve what he would like to have. And but for its thinkings of this multilateralism, I think China will find more constructive things, including this kind of multipolar world. And the United States is going to take leadership in the future too. And I think at the same time, Obama said that he needs the leaders of other countries to work together, and including China. I think Xi Jinping is a kind of new leader, would like to take more responsibilities, and based on China's capabilities. We realized that China is now in a new stage. And Xi Jinping raised the slogan in China of the Chinese dream. This is something it's not really new, but this kind of terminology is new in China. When they talk about what is Chinese dreams, they also talk about the Chinese dream can be realized only when some other countries' dream realized together. That is also in some way is the world dream too. I think this is realized that we are in a very much new era of globalization, and China's fate is closely related with the fate of other countries and of the world. I think this is something very much different from 10 years ago.
Well, I won't try and put you back on the spot that you artfully stepped away from with respect to these students, but let's carry on with our questions, and right in the middle, please.
Hi, my name is Tadashi Ano. I'm a visiting scholar from Sophia University, Tokyo. I kind of hate to sort of bring this discussion back to a more sort of a difficult direction, but since I am from a country which has important economic relations, but also some significant amount of tensions with China, I'll have to ask this question. You said that China's rise has led to increased amount of competition between China and the United States, and also with China and Japan. I very much agree with it, but I wonder to what extent the increased tension between China and the United States and China and neighboring countries is driven by specific behavior of countries on both sides. But China has had this policy of peaceful rise over the past 10 years or for a dozen years, and until recently, and people in the East Asian region generally sort of found this kind of idea to be pretty convincing. However, in Japan and in certain other sort of countries of the region, it seems that China's kind of behavior vis-a-vis some sort of islands in the East China Sea and South China Sea in the past few years have sort of created this impression that China now might feel confident enough, strong enough to sort of challenge kind of territorial kind of status quo using what one might call coercive diplomacy. And this is certainly a cause of worry in some of China's neighboring countries. And I do not think that it is in China's long-term national interest for this kind of impression to spread in the region. So how would you sort of respond to those people who claim that China may be kind of veering off the course of kind of peaceful rise that it has pursued over the past 10, 15 years? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I think I can say China is still or continue to carry out the peaceful rise policies, I think undoubtedly. But we admit now we are in a kind of period. There could be more tensions between China with some neighboring countries, including Japan. There are many reasons. One of the reasons, the major reason, is China has become more stronger. And this raised some concerns of some countries, for instance, is Japan. Japan, for many years, after the World War II, has been the leading country in the Asian areas, especially in the East Asia, and because of its very much successful economic development, and also its peaceful policies. And but Japan, for many years, would see in the future as the leading role in these areas. So the rising above China could constitute some kind of challenges to Japan's role in these areas. This is obviously. But more important is that we have some important issues, disputed issues, unsolved, including the territory issues and means the islands, also historical issues. And the historical issues is something between us unsolved, and this is kind of unique. We all know the history between us. But because of the some historical reasons, this has been put aside. And when the United States and Japan reached the peace agreement, and that was the Cold War period after the Korean War. So China was not involved in this kind of peace treaties. Both mainland China and the Kuomintang regime in Taiwan. So then when we normalize our relations after the President Nixon visited China, and for the major goals of the two countries to normalize relations, to improve our relations, to establish our economic mutual beneficial relations, these history issues and also the island disputes also in some ways put aside. But nowadays, when China is rising up, and at the same time, Japan's economy is not in the good shape, and in Japan, the nationalism is rising up because of its kind of uncomfortable situation in economic terms, also in political terms. In China, because it's rising up, its nationalism is also in the rise. And in China, we have to admit that this kind of these changes have created kind of vacuums of its value system, because the traditional values is kind of far away. Then we have the socialism and communism values. Then after Cultural Revolution, we adapt the policy to build a market economy. And these kind of idealistic values are also been denied in some way. And so in this kind of vacuum of values, the nationalism is ready for people to grasp. That's also its natural sense. In this kind of situation, my observation is we will have kind of difficult period, maybe in next 3-5 years. And the territory island dispute cannot be solved in a short term. And we can only put it aside for a while and create conditions. Then maybe in the future we can find a way to handle that. So in this period we can only manage the situation. The case is somewhat different in the South China Sea. But I think the background is similar.
If I could put a sharper edge on that, I think the question is, if China is saying that it's pursuing peaceful rise, why is it taking aggressive unilateral actions in the South China Seas?
I don't think China is taking unilateral aggressive actions. In the South China Sea, for many years, China has been very much inclusive and tolerant. But at the same time, countries like Vietnam, like Philippines, and conduct a lot of activities in these areas. So just as in the Diaoyu Island with Japan, this time the other part put the first provocative activities, then China react strongly. In the South China Sea, the same is true. We react much strongly than before. Because China is big, because China is rising up, so the attention focused on China. And the people are talking about a more assertive China when China is rising up. That has become a kind of public opinion in the international arenas. And I should also say China has not done a very good job in its public relations, in its policy explanations. So this also is one of the reasons of the image in nowadays. And this is my opinions.
Yes, here on the side, please. Rexwell, can you bring the microphone there? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mara Mejia. I'm an undergraduate third year. So You made the point in which you talk about a multipolar system and that it would be the best to provide stability. So since the end of the Second Great War and the collapse of the last multipolar system, the number of interstate conflicts has dramatically increased. Can we expect that number to rise as we move toward a new multipolar system in which the distribution of power is more shared among countries and therefore they might try to seek an edge out over each other?
So does multipolarity increase the opportunities for conflict as it has in the past? You argued that multipolarity was preferable to bipolarity because it was a greater distribution of power and therefore that created greater stability. But as I understood the question, the historical evidence
is there a correlation between a multipolar system and the level of violence between states?
I think this is my conceptual thinkings about the possibilities. But if it becomes true, it will have some conditions there. And multipolarity could be a stable structure when all the countries take a constructive attitude toward these multipolarities. If some others want to be dominant in these kind of structures, I don't think we can be so optimistic about that. But I think it's possible because the multipolarity will be the natural development, the tendencies of the international relations. And those countries who have larger populations, who have natural resources, who have larger territories, will have become more stronger and play a more important role, just like these BRIC countries, like Brazil, like Russia, China, India. I think this is only a natural development. And the key role is the United States. I have a kind of positive attitude to the United States in the future roles there. I think some of you may have read a very important report called by the National Intelligence Council of the 2030s, and before that is 2025 about that. In that report, it also predicted in the future, in maybe 10 to 20 years, and the world will develop in multi-polarized. And the United States will not be such a powerful superpower anymore. And that is inevitable. So in that kind of situation, if we do not take a constructive policy attitudes, because we all need a stable world structure and a system and order, which can only be achieved by working together. So this is a kind of a reasonable development of us, but the subjective attitude and the policy goal is very much important. I think most nations will realize that, and in this kind of modernization process, which has been involving more and more developing nations in this process. And nation state, in some way, is less important than before. We have more non-state players. But at the same time, nation state is more important if it can play more constructive roles there, because the international politics is still a state of anarchy. So this is a kind of thinkings I have. Thank you.
Do you want to follow up at all, or do you want to defer to your colleague? There's a next question. Do you want to just add one more point?
I guess my point is, should we expect violence to increase? Is it reasonable to assume that states being rational actors, are they going to expect to try to gain more than they currently have?
I didn't.
Do you expect there to be an increase in violence or not?
Increasing violence, I think it's possible. Because we are talking about the power centers, but many other factors are playing roles there. We see the things happening in the Middle East, and the nations in a transition process. And this transition process cannot be easy, especially those we have the religious conflicts, we have the secular fightings, we have these ethnic or many other things. We cannot solve these issues in a short term. And so revolutionary or evolutionary process can experience a very difficult time in some areas. In these areas, the important thing is that which cannot be solved by the outside force and outside interference. Outside interference can only for temporarily to punish some side, some forces. But the issues and the problems cannot be solved, can only be solved by the internal process, such as in the Egypt, in the Libya. So in this transitional period, the violence is inevitable. It could be increased in some way. It's possible.
I think the question right next door.
My name is Erica Yan, and I have a question about the cyber attacks of U.S. companies by Chinese government. I'm just wondering, whether you have some insights about it, and then would it affect China-U.S. relations in the future, and how would it affect it?
China-U.S. relations, I think, one point I didn't mention is that this competition has one feature, is China want to be this relationship based on more leveling playground. And for many years, because United States is very much stronger, and China is a weak part, the relationship has not been equal for many years. That is true. When China is rising up, it's become stronger. The automatic national feeling is that we should address that and to be more equal partner, to be a more equal competitor. And in some way, in some people in China could be hasty to address these kind of inequality in a short term. That created some conflicts and could create some scary feelings in the United States and even in some other countries. I think, but in principle, I agree that this is not an equal relations. We have to address that. The United States should realize that. And this should be the process. The challenge for China is that we can address that in an incremental and a peaceful way. So the sophistication and the wisdom are very much important. And the better understanding of the two sides are very much important. From the United States side, should realize that and take a constructive attitude towards that. I think it's possible we can move in that direction.
But I think it's difficult for the U.S. to be constructive when we feel, to get to the point of the question, that China is cheating. Mm-hmm. And in effect, we understand that sovereign nations collect intelligence against the other side. China collects intelligence about the U.S. collects intelligence about China. Mm-hmm. But there's a concern about Chinese hacking into American corporations, into stealing intellectual property rights through hacking, through cyber attacks against the U.S., and that these are centered within the Chinese military. So I think that's the question, and how can we accept China as an equal when we think that your behavior is antagonistic toward that kind of level playing field?
Okay, this has been reported in the U.S. newspapers, and I don't know how true it is in the fact. But in the other way, I would like to think this kind of relationship based on the inequality, including the different powers. United States has the huge superiorities, and we can see the facts reviewed by in Snowden about the U.S. taking advantage of its superiority, of the power of its internet capabilities to take all these activities to get information of the others. What we know is only those released. I would guess we don't know many things which has not been released. So this is the issues we have to discuss about that. One of the things I think is I mentioned the word of asymmetric. This asymmetric is a serious challenge for us, including this kind of capabilities. And but the way China to approach to that is to take an asymmetric approach and measures to counter this kind of asymmetric relationship. So in some way, this is what China has to do. United States newspapers accuse, or United government accuse of the Chinese militaries involved to get the U.S. companies and corporations informations and to take advantage of that. I don't know how true it is that. And we don't see the evidence in the newspapers. Maybe it is. But the one thing I think is positive is the two sides just had serious discussions in the strategic and the economic dialogue on these cyber things. And cyber security become, I think, a more urgent thing than the other security issues between us. I think just like some other issues, this also involves the issue of intellectual property rights there. And if we review the history of many other nations, this intellectual property rights has always been the issue of those later developed countries with the early developed countries. Then when they develop into some kind of stages, and this issue will become kind of receding in some ways. I think between China and the United States, we are also in this process.
Question here in front. Could you hold for just 1 sec, please, so that everyone else can hear you?
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Paul Silverstein. I'm at the Latin American Center. I'm very interested in your talk. I would like to get some reflections from you on Latin America, the Americas, because you mentioned a couple of times multi-interests. Where does China stand vis-a-vis countries like Brazil and Mexico? And what would you like to see for future relationships between this part of the world and China?
Thank you. Economically speaking, I think we have become more and more related with each other. I think China has developed a great deal of economic programs and cooperations with Brazil and also with Mexico. But at the same time, I think we are at the same level of our economic development. So we also are competitive with each other. So this is a challenge to us, and in some ways it's an obstacle to our economic cooperations. I know in China and Mexico, and China relations with Brazil is much better because we need the materials and resources and the things there. So it's a kind of complementary. I think politically we have more things to can coordinate it and can work together to address some of the common issues. That is happening, and I think both countries with China has established the strategic partnerships and emphasize the importance of this kind of relationship. I think we can also build up this relation in a larger context, that is the regional and the global orders. And in that terms, we have a lot more similarities and to work together. I think generally speaking, China takes a very much positive and constructive attitude towards our relations with countries.
Would you like to respond in any way, sir?
Just from my experience, it's kind of amazing from the point of view of the scholars that work on Brazil, on diplomacy, that they consider Itamaraty, the Brazilian foreign officer, really don't know China. And I don't know whether China knows Brazil, but it would be desirous for both parties to really get to know each other a lot better. I think in what you're looking for in the future, 30, 35 years down the line, it would be in both China and Brazil's interest to come together. and Mexico also. I know it's more difficult for Mexico for many reasons, but the rest of this area, Peru is becoming more important to China. Rather than this tremendous focus on the United States and concerns about issues in oil from the Middle East, there might be a better path for China.
Okay, I just want to add a few words. I think personally, I'm optimistic about our relations because China has been much more deeply involved in the Latin America than before. And one thing you have pointed out, which is very much important, for many years we are just distantly apart with each other, and we do not understand each other very well. And we do not have the people who speak the other side languages. So since I think maybe 8 or 9 years ago, the Spanish-speaking students have become very much kind of attractive to the company's employees. In our institutions, when we want to find some Spanish
and Portuguese as well, of course.
Portuguese as well, it's difficult to find. So nowadays, these language studies speak Spanish and Portuguese, and these small language students become kind of much easier for them to find much better paid jobs in China's market and also in these external relation activities. I think it takes 5 to 10 years, then we have enough of these kind of people and we understand better, I think. But the future will be bright. Yes.
Well, you've mentioned 5 to 10 years a couple of times, and we'll hope to have you back in 5 or 10 years to hear about your evaluation of what progress we've made.
Okay.
We want to leave our last word to our guests. There are always more questions than we have time available, but would you like to say anything by way of conclusion?
I want to thank you, Dale, and thank all professors and the students here, and to come here to listen to my presentations. And also thank you very much for all the questions. The last thing I would say is the other side, the outside world, more often than not, would think, and China's policy is very much sophisticatedly thought and designed and the strategies. But actually, I think China is in its process of rising up mainly based on its rapid economic development. In many areas, in its foreign policy, in its social development, in its political reforms. And sometimes we have our own challenges because in these areas, our development, our reform cannot catch up with our economic development. So there are some gaps, some vacuums. And because of this rapid development, we are not fast enough to adapt ourselves to these kind of changes. These also are the factors, the reasons that we have some problems and issues. So we have to consider these kind of things and situations. It's not easy for the leadership of government to handle this kind of huge population, a huge country in this kind of fast development process. So what I'm saying is you do not automatically regard everything is thought thoroughly from the government, manipulated by government, which is not true. If you take a more objective attitude towards China, if you think China has developed in this modernization process in a rather short period, 30 to 40 years, then we cover the process of other countries, West countries, about 100, 200 years. It's inevitable we will have more challenges, problems with us, including our external relations. So in that attitude, you can have a more inclusive attitude in the policies. That could give China and more rooms to play a more constructive roles to thinking about more considerately. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you. Thank you all.